All right, so today we're going to talk about Chiron. Chiron is an asteroid in astrology. It's one of the most major asteroids that's often used. So we're going to talk about that one today, but we'll go ahead and go through basically an asteroid series. So we'll talk about other ones as well. So let's go ahead and just kind of get into it. All right. So Chiron is known as the wounded healer. So a lot of people have heard that about Chiron. I'm going to go ahead and just go through the mythology of Chiron, what the general meanings of this asteroid are, and then we're going to talk about it basically through the houses, okay? So Chiron in mythology is basically he's a centaur. Okay, so a centaur obviously is half man, half horse. Now, centaurs notoriously are actually very awful. Chiron is just a very unusual character. Okay, centaurs are known to be very violent. Like there are so many myths of them just basically stealing away girls, getting drunk and pillaging cities and stealing young girls away and all sorts of stuff like that. That's kind of their thing. But Chiron was different than the rest of the centaurs because he wasn't raised in the way that the other centaurs are. So most centaurs are born of another character in mythology called Ixion. So Ixion is basically this like really horrible person, more or less. He's a murderer. And by some accounts, he's the first murderer ever, actually. But by other accounts, he's just the first person to murder like a sibling or a family member. So he's kind of like the Cain of the Cain and Abel story in ancient mythology. Now, Ixion, for his terrible deeds, was bound to a fiery wheel for all of eternity. So basically, he's just doomed to be like tortured. And while he's being tortured, he's actually hooking up with this cloud entity, and they are having the centaurs. And so that's where all the centaurs actually come from. So you can see how their background is kind of a little bit more violent in nature, and they're coming from this kind of bad place. But Chiron is different because he's actually born from a water nymph named Phileria. And Phileria was tricked by a titan named Kronos. Kronos, by the way, is actually the titan associated with time. So I think that's kind of interesting. That's something to keep in the back of your mind while we talk about Chiron. But she was tricked by Kronos because Kronos basically took on the form of a horse to hook up with her. And she's a nymph, so they're kind of like into that sort of thing. But once she gave birth to this half human, half horse being, she was disgusted by it and abandoned him, which is obviously really sad. So Chiron is basically abandoned at birth. Okay. But luckily for him, he gets picked up by the twins Apollo and Artemis. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with those two, but Apollo is one of the coolest gods in Greek mythology. And he's definitely a lot more elevated of a figure than Ixion, that's for sure. He's associated with basically all of the things that take a lot of finesse, like music and poetry. But one of the things that he's really most often associated with is medicine. So, you know where we're going with this because he's the healer, right? So obviously he learns healing from Apollo. Artemis teaches him basically hunting and archery as well. So he becomes very skilled. Okay. So he himself becomes very well respected as he gets older because he becomes so knowledgeable. He's a respected oracle. He's also an astrologer, by the way. Did you know? They talked about astrology too, obviously. That's why it's all a part of this, right? So Chiron himself was an astrologer, but what he's especially known for is being a healer and also a teacher. So he starts to take on the role of mentor to a lot of other Greek heroes, okay? Like Jason, Asclepius, Achilles. I'm sure you guys remember Achilles, and many more. If you guys have seen the movie Hercules, like the cartoon version where he meets up with Philoctetes, right? And Philoctetes is like teaching him how to like be a hero. That's this guy. That's what this guy is. That's his thing. He basically teaches heroes how to be heroes. So he's the ultimate teacher and healer. Unfortunately, what so important to know that the Greek gods are so impressed with how great Chiron is that they actually gift him immortality because they want him to stay alive as long as possible so that he can teach as many Greek heroes as possible. So now he's immortal, but he's given more immortality, which is a little different, and I'll explain that in a second. So what ultimately happens to Chiron is that he gets into this he gets caught up in a battle. Okay, so Hercules gets into this fight with the other centaurs, and I already explained to you how the other centaurs are different. But the other centaurs, we don't need to get into necessarily the nitty gritty here, but suffice it to say that he gets into a scuffle with these other centaurs. Now, at this point, Heracles has already killed the Hydra, which you might remember also from that movie. I think he kills the Hydra in that movie too, the cartoon movie. But anyway, the Hydra is basically this like lake monster with many, many heads. And every time you cut off a head, a new one emerges. So it's like almost impossible to kill it. But Heracles does kill it. And he keeps the poison from the Hydra because the poison is incredibly deadly. Anybody who even touches that poison will immediately die. Okay, so he keeps that obviously as a weapon and dips his arrows in it. And so while he's fighting these other centaurs, he's using these arrows. But unfortunately, he accidentally shoots Chiron because he's also a centaur, even though he's the centaur we like. He's like the only centaur that's a good centaur. So he ends up getting hit accidentally. Okay. Now, for most people, this would kill them instantly. But for Chiron, he was given immortality by Zeus. So because of this, he can't die, but he can still suffer, unfortunately. And so essentially, it just causes immense pain for him. I mean, the worst pain you could possibly imagine, like you're dying, but he never actually reaches death. And he goes through this for days and weeks of just this indescribable pain. And he tries all of his medical knowledge to heal himself, and he ultimately never succeeds. So ultimately, what he does is he begs the gods to take away his immortality because he doesn't want to suffer for an eternity. And they do allow him to do that. They allow him to give his immortality to somebody else. And this is why we know Chiron is the real GOAT, because the most awesome, because he uses this opportunity to give his immortality to Prometheus. Prometheus, side note, deserves his own thing. He's literally like one of the coolest, one of my favorite gods ever, or I guess demigod. Prometheus essentially is the god that gives humans fire. He teaches humans how to use fire, which has obviously a lot of deeper meanings to it. He gives humans knowledge, and the gods are mad about it. So they basically send him to eternal damnation to have his liver picked out for the literally every day for the rest of his life. So Chiron ultimately saves Prometheus in this moment. And in response to all of this, the gods commemorate him in their most famous way of doing so, which is giving him a constellation. So he has the constellation Centaurus. And this is the constellation here of Centaurus that is meant to represent Chiron. You can see that it's really close to Scorpio here in the sky, which kind of makes sense if we think about it, I suppose, right? So that's the background myth about Chiron, but what is that? That's all well and good, but like, what does that mean, right? In the context of what we're doing. So when we're measuring Chiron in the chart, we're actually measuring an asteroid, not that constellation. So there's an asteroid that is also called Chiron. And I think that this is really cool to talk about because it's easy for us to think of asteroids like they're these like tiny little morsels of rocks out there that don't really matter or something. Chiron is basically considered to be a minor planet. So it has its own orbit around the sun. Here's its orbit here in white. So you can see this one's Jupiter, here's Saturn. Chiron has a weird orbit here, as you can see, but he does orbit the sun on his own. He even has his own ring, kind of like Saturn. So he has his own gravity as well, his own ring, and he's orbiting the sun as well. So he's a lot more major than what you might imagine as an asteroid. So he spends about 4 years in a sign. And he's different from many asteroids in a lot of ways. One of them is that he is not mainly made of water, and that's because he's too far from the sun. So he has some differences to other asteroids. Most asteroids are closer to the sun than Chiron. So as far as meanings of Chiron, okay? So Chiron is basically about the wound that we can never really heal, right? That was the myth of Chiron, right? Like he has this wound that he can never heal. However, it's also a strength and how we can help other people. So we'll talk through that like by house and how that plays out. I think it'll make more sense in examples. But here are some of the meanings that you could consider in regards to Chiron. One is that it shows us one of our biggest vulnerabilities. Okay, Chiron is about one of the deepest wounds that you've ever experienced that you can never really forget about. It'll affect you forever. Okay. but it also represents healing powers or healing abilities that we have, some sort of wisdom or something that we could teach on. But it comes at a great price, this knowledge, right? But it is something that we can help other people with. It often is associated with past lives as well. Okay. Because in your chart, anything that is associated with like really early childhood life, which Chiron is, that often is also associated with our past lives because our karma or whatever we went through in our past lives is sort of relived early in this lifetime as well, right? So it is often related to our past lives also. So like I said, it's basically your deepest wound. Think about it this way, like there are definitely wounds in life that never go away and can only be transformed, right? Like grief is one of those things. When you experience grief never go, you can't just heal grief, right? The concept of, oh, I'll get past this. No, you really won't, right? When it comes to grief. Well, all you can do is transmute it into wisdom and understanding, and it gives you this like depth of personhood, right? That's basically the energy of Chiron. Hope that makes sense. All right, we're gonna go through some of the houses for Chiron. If you guys want to discuss any of these houses, we can definitely do that. It's kind of a small room, but that's still cool. It could be fun. It's up to you guys though.
I think it's so cool. I
Yeah,
absolutely love like how you give the foundational story of the energetic of the asteroid.
thanks. Yeah, it's an interesting story. I know it's a bit nerdy to get that deep with it, but I'm glad that it helps.
No. I honestly, I think it gives like a great foundation to be able to build upon and understand that energetic and how it relates to yourself, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that. I feel that way also about my own like astrological journey. I think that a really big reason that astrology has stuck with me so much is the mythology that is associated with
Right.
it. And honestly,
Well,
that's
that's
how, yeah, that's how ancient people felt about it too. That's part of why they made these stories. They were all sort of intertwined as a part of their practice, and driving
right.
home.
Yeah, no, same. I love learning by stories and analogies. And so it just hits home. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Let's go through some of the houses for Chiron. So here's the thing. Chiron is also important in other ways outside of the houses, right? So I just want to preface with that. It's also important what planets it might be hitting. It's also important if it's hitting any angles, like the ascendant or descendant or anything like that, right? All of that is an important factor. Obviously, we're just going to talk about houses today. But for the first house is considered to have sort of a Mars type energy. So, what I'm about to say also applies if you have Chiron in hard aspect to Mars in your chart, which means like if it's conjunct or squaring it or something like that. Okay. So, when Chiron's in the first house, this is a very significant place for Chiron to be. And the reason I say that is because the first house is the house of how other people interpret us. Okay. So when we have Chiron there, there's a very strong chance that other people will see us as sort of the incarnate of the wounded healer. Okay. This is like really taking on the wounded healer energy very strongly if it falls into the first house. Um, Now, there's just some things about it that are really interesting. I'm going to kind of talk about it from the perspective of like the deep wound that it is associated with, and then how this becomes wisdom as well. Okay. And what their like strength is associated with it. So the wound around it often has to do with asserting yourself or regarding like your self identity. Okay. So usually with this placement, these people, were challenged in regards to their self identity in some way or held back from being able to go after the things that they want to, or just like what's the word I'm looking for, shamed for being themselves or trying to do something. You get where I'm going with this, right? So they can often feel like competing is wrong, arguing is wrong, standing up for yourself is wrong, right? Like all of these things can start to feel that way to them. And so they kind of become people pleasers, frankly. A lot of times. A lot of times I see them become people pleasers where they are putting other people's needs before their own a lot. And so this is kind of Chiron at play, right? Wherever Chiron lands is where we feel the most like maybe it's not worth it or something, right? So when you have Chiron in the first, it's like, oh, am I as important as the other people around me? And a lot of times people with displacement would say no, then they are not as important as the people around them. So there can be feel like fears around being seen as selfish as well. And so these fears around being selfish and these people pleasing sort of activities obviously affect your sense of identity as well, because your identity is associated with being counted amongst the group, right? Like if you're not counted amongst the group, then who are you? Where are you? What are you doing? Like there's like an issue around identity there with that. So a lot of times this is related to like early childhood stuff. We would want to, we don't got to get that deep. The chart will always give us more details on those, but a lot of times I find that these people were maybe like bullied or like had people kind of being like mean or shaming them or something like that. Those are like kind of like common themes that I see with those kind of placements. But here's what's great about them. Here's where the wisdom part comes in. Okay. So the wisdom side of this is that since they feel that way about themselves, they understand the pain of that more than anybody else. And so therefore they are major champions for the underdog. Okay. They often don't give that to themselves like they should. And that's the theme of Chiron, is like it's the thing that you don't give to yourself, but you're really good at giving it to other people. So this placement is really good at seeing the underdog and seeing the person that maybe has some talent but is being overlooked or isn't really getting the appreciation they should or something like that, and like helping kind of pick that person up and like, come on, you can do it, and encouraging them. So there is definitely some wisdom to that. They can be seen as a mentor. They honestly do really great in any kind of like mentoring type roles in my experience. Really good at like kind of encourage, what would I say, like a coach or something, right? Like where you're like encouraging people into being their best selves and things like that. But one of the things that I would say about them is that they oftentimes find a lot of success when they actually share their own story, which they are often reticent to do. They're often reticent to do because sharing your own story, even though it's literally just I'm saying literally the facts of what happened, that's enough for this placement to feel like they're being selfish or like or stealing the spotlight in some way, or you get where I'm going with all of this. But yet when they do, it is so impactful and it impacts a lot of people. So I, of course, as always, put examples. I know I'm not necessarily a super fan of Oprah, but I think she's such a good example of this, right? Because she had obviously like a tough childhood that you can tell she's not always like super keen on talking about. But she has talked about it. And I mean, she's literally Oprah, like she's super famous because of that. And not just because of that, also because she is bringing forward people too, right? So she's doing this underdog thing that I'm talking about. She's like bringing up other people, like, look, here's somebody that's great, and here's somebody that's great, and giving them opportunities as well. So Oprah is just such a good example that I had to use her, honestly. But those are kind of our takeaways for the first house. Do you guys have any questions about that one? I'm going to go to the second house next. Okay, cool. All right, second house. So for the second house, when Chiron falls here, usually the wound is around their stability and their possessions. Okay. So Audrey Hepburn is a really great example here because Audrey Hepburn's background, I don't claim to be an Audrey Hepburn like expert, but my understanding of her background is that she basically lost everything when she was young during World War II, and had to come over to the States and like start over and all that stuff. So she kind of makes sense here. But there are a lot of other people that have this placement too. Actually, one that might surprise you that has this placement is Donald Trump. He actually has this placement as well. So there are a lot of examples of people that are actually born into like very wealthy families. But even in that case, there's some wound that is around the concept of wealth, in a couple of different ways, right? I've seen this play out in multiple ways, and usually it plays out each way with each person to some degree, which is true for Audrey Hepburn too, now that I think about it. Either there's this fear of like, I'm going to lose everything. I think they always have that fear, honestly. I think everyone that has Chiron in the second house is always like afraid that they're going to lose everything, no matter how rich they are. It doesn't matter how rich they are. I've had clients that are super wealthy with this placement that think they're going to be poor tomorrow. Like, this is just one of those placements. But also they can sometimes feel guilty about what they have, believe it or not. Also, that's also part of this placement. So they can have a lot, but then they can like feel like blame themselves in some way, that they're just always blaming themselves in some way around their possessions. Okay. They never feel like they're successful enough, and they sometimes think that they're not attractive enough as well. And all of this is because the second house is the house of values and like our self-worth. Okay. So that plays a really big role in what they're playing out with that. So, so I put guilt, they may have guilt regarding their wealth and possessions. I see that happen a lot. And also with the family too, I noticed that this placement often has a lot of tension or karma around like their family lineage. The second house is very underestimated as to how often it is associated with the stability that and foundations that are set by our families in our early life. As well. Like I also noticed that there was a lot of the royal family that had this placement as well. Like Queen Elizabeth was one. I can't remember all of them, but there were some royal family members in here as well. So that's interesting, right? They have a major fear of loss. They never feel like they have enough stability. They feel like things could like be lost at any moment. They could have $1 billion and they'll feel like it could like disappear tomorrow. So where does the wisdom come in here though? All of those people, even though they are super insecure at their ability at those things, are really good at those things. Wouldn't you agree? All of those people are very wealthy. And here's what it comes down to for them. They're very resilient, actually. That's what it really comes down to, because they live in this headspace, right? Where they feel like they could lose anything at any moment. So they're in this headspace of having lost everything that they have, even though they haven't lost everything that they have. And when you've lost everything that you have, you learn a certain wisdom from that space, right? You learn how to get through without having those things, or how to wrap your head around what life would be like without those things. And it also starts to sink in for you that what is truly important, what is the real value of things and in the real value of life, and etc. Okay. And so this makes them very resilient people. And so I would say that's their biggest wisdom, is basically understanding the worth of things and the true value of things and being able to get through really tough times. So again, they suffer from the placement, but they can help everybody else with it. So if you want like financial advice, this is like the person to go to. Somebody with this placement. Third house. So third house is our house of speaking. So this is a tough place to have Chiron in the third house. Basically, this is all about wounds regarding speaking and expressing yourself. Okay. So these wounds could have to do with siblings, early education, and or speech in general. Okay. I've seen a lot of people that have this placement have literal speaking difficulties when they were younger. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and just say I actually have this placement, and I did have speaking problems for many, many years. I had to go to speech therapy until I was probably like 10. And I always had a really hard time with expressing myself. And that's what I see reflected in a lot of people who have this placement, where their early education and their early life, they have a hard time. It might not literally be how they speak, but it could also just be how they are learning, or just how what their education is like in their early life, and so on and so forth. Okay. So with that said, obviously they, as the Chiron person now, is turning around and saying, I want to support other people's expression, number one, right? That's one of their first things. I think a lot of people with this placement feel like they are not understood when they're younger. And so they kind of turn around and say, I want to understand everybody else now. And I want to help other people understand themselves and each other, and so on. That's why I think Sigmund Freud is such a good example of this placement, because he's Sigmund Freud, right? Like he's like the most famous psychologist of all time. So, or psychiatrist, I should say, I believe. But regardless, no, he was a psychologist. I'm pretty sure I'm right about that. Regardless, though, the point is they have a unique understanding of other people's psychology to some degree, and but it's because that's what they're seeking out to understand. So one of the other things that I said was education. They have a very unusual learning style, usually, this placement. And so you'll often find things like, some examples that I've seen play out is people that are mispronouncing words because they've only read them and not spoken them, or maybe they were taught something incorrectly when they were younger, or something like that, or they just have something unusual about their early experience that makes them have these very unconventional ideas later, and their methods and the way they go about things and their point of view is very unconventional and unique later. And so that unique way of expressing themselves can catch a lot of attention from other people, and they can be seen as very inspirational. And it's very ironic that they are seen as such great speakers and educators when they themselves are always feeling like they are not doing well talking. That's always how they feel. It's like they're always insecure about whatever it is that they're saying. Am I talking too much? Am I talking too little? Et cetera, et cetera. That's like always on their mind. But you can see again, it's again the same theme, right? Of like having this insecurity that is like, you're actually amazing at it. Why are you insecure? But you'll never not be insecure at it. It's just one of those things. This also applies if you have it aspecting Mercury. And I should have said about the second house, this applies to if it aspects Venus, just for reference for the video. Let's go to the fourth house. This is really one of the toughest placements for Chiron to be, honestly. Aside from the first, I think it's tough in the first too, to be honest. But in the fourth house, any of the angular houses, which is the first, fourth, seventh, or 10th. And the fourth house, it's really tough because the fourth house is about our sense of safety. So when somebody has Chiron here, they feel like their sense of safety is very challenged. Okay. So I think Eminem is a really good example of what I'm talking about here, right? We all know about his early life. I mean, he had a whole movie about it. So I think we all know a lot about his background. But these people usually didn't feel safe in their childhoods. And this could be connected to their family. It could be connected to their sense of belonging. Again, I think Eminem is a really great example because he obviously did have a lot of conflicts within his family, but he also was in an industry that, you know, was kind of racially against him in a big way, right? It was a bunch of, I'm sure, I think he's expressed that many times that, you know, being a white rapper is not easy. This can also, though, turn people into being very empathetic to other people that are outcasted. And so we all know about the beef that went down with Drake and Kendrick Lamar, or I assume we know. And I'm definitely on the side of Kendrick Lamar. I'm going to be honest. But it is interesting that the one person that was sort of trying to low-key stand up for Drake a little bit was Eminem. And it makes sense, right? Because Eminem himself felt like an outcast in the industry. And so maybe he might feel that way somewhat about Drake as well, who's biracial, right? The point is that people with this placement feel like they are an outcast, okay? They feel like they never really fit in anywhere. And this causes a lot of domestic issues for them as well. Unfortunately, they often replay out some of the domestic issues that they experienced early in life. So they could have trouble with settling down or being settled or feeling at home, and this could affect some of their family relationships as well. But this is all because they don't feel safe. They almost never feel truly like they belong somewhere. And that's hard to live with. That's why I say this is one of the hardest Chiron placements, in my opinion. That said, they themselves can be extremely inspirational. I think a lot of their messages is really about believing in yourself and knowing that you being your true self and relying on yourself is the only real security in life. I think that there are so many Eminem songs that reflect that. But yeah, they really, kind of similar to the first house, they really support the underdog. But in this case, especially in the first house, I think it's more about the underdog that is actually talented. Whereas in this case, I think it's more about the people that are outcasted, that are not being taken in. So let's go to the fifth house. So the fifth house also is kind of tough because this is the house of our children and our inner child. Okay. So when we see Chiron in the fifth house, this can represent some big inner child wounds, frankly. These people could have been ignored as a child or just not been able to have fun for whatever reason. I chose Kim Kardashian, who obviously wasn't ignored. She definitely was in the spotlight at a young age, but she's a really great example because it shows how at a young age, her play was sort of restricted, right? Like she wasn't in the spotlight just to be there for fun, which is what children are actually supposed to be doing. The fifth house is about just having fun for the sake of it, not to make it look some type of way or have it be perfect or have it make money or to monetize it or anything like that. It's literally just joy for the sake of joy, which is what children are supposed to be doing, right? And Kim Kardashian maybe wasn't entirely able to do that, right? Like she was sort of restricted and put into work very early. So this can result in having major guilt whenever they try to enjoy themselves. It can be really difficult for them to just let loose. They might work all the time. I get a lot of perfectionist vibes from these people as well. Self-conscious about how things are going to turn out. And that really kills the creative process, right? The creative process dies under the guise of perfection, right? What creativity is about the very process that I just talked about, which is why the 5th house is associated with children. It's also associated with all of our creative projects. Because our true creative projects in life need that energy in order for it to be successful. So they can sometimes feel like they struggle with being creative, actually. And that's very ironic, as always, with these Chiron placements, the irony, because they really are inspirational to creators and they attract a lot of creative people. And that's so true of Kim as well. She has many creatives in her sphere, right? Who are inspired by her and want to try out different things. She, fashion designers, makeup artists, musicians, like so many of those people really like her and want to be around her and feel creatively inspired by her, even though she herself maybe doesn't feel like the most creative person, right? So that's kind of the gist of Chiron through the 5th house. All right, we're going to talk about Chiron in the 6th house. All right, so these people are super sensitive to their environments, okay? Like they could even be hypochondriacs to a degree. And this is because the 6th house is the house of basically our health and well-being, okay? It's about all the things that are in our environment as well. So they could have very unusual habits that they're very strict and adamant about them. And a lot of times this is rooted in experiences when they were younger, a feel of difficult experiences that have to do with their health or their well-being. A lot of times these people feel like they didn't have enough, or maybe they like felt like they lost their stuff or didn't have enough stuff, or they could have been in poverty or something like that as well. And in conjunction to that, so I guess I'll say like there's a sense here too of my health isn't being taken care of. So maybe they had like a health issue that wasn't properly taken care of when they were younger or something like that. All in relation to that. And so they often feel like they're very easily overwhelmed by their environment. That's why I put overwhelmed here, because the 6th house is about all of our habits and routines and our general environment, our relationship with coworkers, all those little tasks that we do that add up to our health and well-being, like brushing your teeth and stuff like that. All of those are related to the 6th house. And so they can be very picky about those sort of activities. I use JLo because she has this placement. But some of the things that I've heard about her, I obviously don't know the validity of all of these statements, but I've heard that she can be very picky about what she has in her dressing room as a part of her wardrobe and who she works with. I remember reading an article not that long ago that said she refused to work with I think it's Virgos. I'm pretty sure it was Virgos, which, well, no, I'm just kidding. I like Virgos. But I'm just saying, it's just funny that she will literally just fire background dancers if she finds out they're a Virgo. So she can be kind of hard to work with, is sort of her reputation. But it kind of makes sense because she does come from a background, right? Jenny from the block and all of that. She comes from less to do, I guess we'll say, background. So I think in her mind, knowing about this placement, she can maybe feel like, that that's just around the corner for her at all times, that could happen to her again, or that she could have a need that doesn't get met, or have this tough relationship with a boss or a coworker or something like that. She probably had a lot of really tough relationship with bosses and coworkers as well with this placement. The one thing that I'd say that is really great about this placement, though, trying to transmute this into wisdom, is to say, man, these people really know how to make themselves like indispensable at work. And JLo's kind of like that too, I think, in a lot of her placements, and the things that she's done, right? Is like, you can't fire JLo, it's JLo, right? And I feel that way about a lot of people that I've seen with this placement, where they really know how to get their work done, man. Like they are really hard workers and they can give a lot of really great advice about how to work towards something better. So if you're like, man, I just don't know what is wrong with this situation, maybe it's some minor detail that I've overlooked, this is the kind of person you want to ask about that. Okay. If there's some sign of minor detail and you're like, oh, my health is just off and I don't know why, or whatever, or I don't know how to like get this routine down or something, or I'm having problems at work, this is the person to ask about that, because they have overcome a lot to be in a good position, so they'll know better than anybody. Seventh house is also a pretty tough one. I mean, all of these are going to be kind of tough, right? But I think the angular houses are probably the toughest, and the seventh house is an angular house. So there you go. Here, I would say, the seventh house is the house of fairness. So you know where this is going already. Okay. This is the house of what's fair and balance and the house of the other. Okay. So these people are often taken advantage of and overlooked by others. Okay. They can be really great at prioritizing others, but they take really big losses in regards to relationships. And a lot of times that's actually related to their sense of self-worth. So obviously Monica Lewinsky is a really good example, right? We all know what like went down with Monica Lewinsky, and it has to do with somebody else, right? This placement kind of suggests to me that she was the one used in that situation, to be honest with you. But that's a lot of what I see in these situations is they're sort of like used by other people as like a stepping stone in some way to something else. So they can have a lot of time. There's always at least like one toxic relationship in this person's background, okay, that I find. And those toxic relationships can last a really long time, to be honest. I've seen people in long-term relationships with this placement, but I always kind of wonder when I see this, like, are you being taken advantage of in this relationship though? Because a lot of people get taken advantage of with this one. And as I said, this is really rooted in their sense of self-worth, which has to do with how they were treated as a child. They might not have been treated equally as a child in some way. Like they might have had more expectations on their end to do something rather than being poured into, which is what we're supposed to do with kids, right? Like kids are supposed to be first, I think. Ideally, I guess astrology agrees with us, right? That children really should be kind of like at least somewhat prioritized, but with this placement, usually there's an issue around that too. With that said, being that this is the house of like fairness and like all legal matters, these people can be really great counselors, legal advisors, things like that. So if you're looking for like a relationship counselor or something, this is definitely the person for that. They are really good at understanding what other people need and how to make that work, how to build around that. So they can be really good at that. And that's sort of the transmutation of it. I'm going to jump into the eighth house just for like time's sake. For the eighth house is a scary house. Like we're all afraid of the eighth house, I think. The eighth house is the house of loss, right? Death and loss and all those like extreme things that we don't like to think about are all in the eighth house. So when Chiron falls here, there's a strong fear of loss. And even sometimes like paranoia. So these people can be a survivor, especially in regards to unequal power dynamics. Okay, they could have been abused even by powerful leaders early in life. I use Bruce Lee because I believe the idea around him is that he was killed by the Chinese government. I'm pretty sure, right? So obviously, in his case, right, he was really afraid of what the Chinese and rightfully so in this case, right? Afraid of what the Chinese government was out to do, maybe that they were out to get him. I know there's like talk of him thinking that he was being watched and monitored by them and so on and so forth, which honestly, that definitely could have been true. And I don't want to scare people that have this placement. You might not, just because you have this placement, that doesn't mean you're being watched by the government, okay? Don't freak out. In this case, it was true, but that doesn't mean it's true for you, right? But regardless, these people really did lose something massive and just dealt with it. I really feel for this placement because I feel like they really just had a situation where somebody abused their power. I'll put it that way. Okay. That said, these people can become bossy sometimes where they feel like they need to control a situation because they're afraid. So I have seen them get bossy sometimes. And they can also start to feel like things are a little hopeless. Like, why bother? We can never win against we can never overcome these authorities. Life's not fair. Like, those are all things that I've heard from people with displacement. But I would say it does transmute into a very deep wisdom in a couple of ways. Number one, these people are very hardworking. Okay. These people feel like they need to work until like the end of their days. Like, if anything, they work too hard. They always feel like they need to be like steps ahead of whatever is going on around them. And so because of that, they work very, very hard. And they're also a major powerhouse. I mean, Bruce Lee, come on, he's like such a powerhouse, right? He's inspirational even, really. These people really know how to fight through hard times. And they can really inspire other people to fight through hard times as well. So I would say major powerhouse for these guys. These are the kind of people that I would be like, if there was like a conflict, if I was like in a war or something, God forbid, I hope that never happens to me. I don't want that, knock on wood, right? But if I was in a war, this is like the kind of person that I would want to follow, if you feel me. Ninth house. So for the ninth house, the ninth house is the house of like our beliefs, basically. I'm majorly boiling down, obviously, but it's about our beliefs and our overall, our faith, our direction in life. So this placement a lot of times had very strong expectations on them growing up. They could have been in like a very religious family or just like a strict family, a family that has very strong guidelines. Okay. Marilyn Monroe, obviously, we know that she came from a super religious family and had to like break away and not become Norma Jean, right? And dye her hair blonde and become a bombshell, and try to break away from that background. Which is what I love about them. I mean, a lot of times these natives really inspire other people to be their best selves, and be extremely forward thinking as well. They can be very inspirational in that sense, like looking ahead and forward thinking and all of that. Elon Musk is another person that has this placement. I don't know a whole lot about his family background, is why I didn't use him, but it is interesting. Actually, I believe there is some tension there, if I recall. As well. But he's obviously like a very forward thinking person, right? So in this case, though, I would say that these people can be very, number one, they can be very skeptical. Okay. They often only believe it when they see it for themselves. Okay. And they also can be very pessimistic, which I think is so interesting because, again, this is like the trick of Chiron. Chiron always on the outside looks like this person's really good at this thing, but internally, that's not how they feel inside. Okay. And that's always how Chiron plays out. So when it's in the ninth house, to other people, they can seem very optimistic and forward thinking and inspirational. But inside, the way they actually feel is pessimistic, serious, intellectual, skeptical, and all of that good stuff. They can even be a little nihilistic, frankly, where they feel like life has no meaning at all. But the way they transmute that into wisdom is to say, life might not have meaning except for the meaning that I make it, right? Except for the meaning that I give it. That's something that I've heard from a lot of people with this placement, is the meaning of life is what I give it. Which I don't know that I necessarily totally agree personally, but I get the way of thinking, and I think it's very inspirational in its own right. I think a lot of what this is transmuted to is taking control of your destiny is the idea for these people. And I think that's what they're going for. They're trying to take control of their destiny. And that can inspire the rest of us to try to think ahead as well. So I think that that's sort of the positives there. 10th house. This is another really tough one to have Chiron because it's another angular house. There are 4 angular houses. This is the last one. The 10th house is the highest point in the chart, right? So this is our career and how we will be best known by everybody and so on and so forth, right? So the thing of the first house is like how other people see you, but the 10th house is more like your public life. The midheaven is not always in the 10th house, but the midheaven in ancient astrology was often called the secondary ascendant because it's how the public views us. So having Chiron in the 10th house has some similarities to it being in the first house, okay? But in this case, it's more about authority, okay? The 10th house is about authority. So in this case, these people had strong authorities in their life who did not acknowledge them when they were younger. So they have feelings of inadequacy or like they don't deserve certain things. They feel like they never haven't, they feel like they never did good enough. That's how I would put it based on the clients I've had with this placement. So a lot of times they have a tense relationship with like a father, and if not like the father, it could be like a father figure, like a older male in their life or masculine type of person. Somebody that was trying to play that role for them. They can have tensions with just authorities in life in general, really. They don't like authority usually. Honestly, this one. But they can just be very pessimistic in the sense of wanting to do more and get more responsibility, but then also feeling like it's not worth getting more responsibility because the world sucks. Like that's the kind of stuff I've heard from people with this placement. Is no matter what I do, it's never good enough. I want to be in charge, but I don't know if it's worth it because I think the world sucks. But low key, I don't know if I can do it. That's actually what it's about, right? And they also feel like people don't respect them. And I feel like this all really applies to Kanye West. I feel like he feels like people don't respect him. even when he was at like the height of his career, he would talk about people thinking he's a joke or something, right? Like that, right? And it's also pretty obvious to me that he has a major problem with authority. I think we can probably all agree there. I mean, Kanye West was very respected for a long time. Like, a very respected artist. Everybody bought his album. He was super famous, but he still felt like people weren't really respecting him. Here's the thing. That's all internal. Outwardly, though, they can get a lot of attention, obviously, and people think that they do deserve that. But also, they can give really great advice to other people as well. And I've heard that a lot about Kanye West, right? Like they say that about like Kim Kardashian and other people that have been around him, that he like gave them a lot of fashion advice or other types of advice, album advice for other artists and so on and so forth. It's interesting to think about that because he himself is kind of saying like, oh, I don't think it's worth it, but here's how you do it. And that's just so Chiron. Like, oh, the industry sucks, the world sucks, but here's how you have a good career. Here's how you get attention. Here's how you succeed in this industry. So it's just funny because that's how Chiron works out, right? Like, you think you suck at it, you think it's not worth it, but then like you're actually really good at it. Chiron in the 11th house. So the 11th house is about our networks and groups and where we belong. So this is going to be kind of similar to the 4th house, but in a different way. These people also feel like they always stand out. And they do always stand out in a good way. I love that. But these people have a fear of standing out, even though they really can't help but to stand out. Okay. They are really afraid to be on their own and stand out because they think that it's going to lead to judgment from other people. And that judgment is going to lead to something bad happening to them. If they don't belong anywhere and people aren't going to help them, they're going to be out on their own and be judged for whatever it is that they're doing. That is the thing that they're afraid of and that they always think is happening. And it is true that they do really stand out. So that part is sort of true. They feel like they don't fit in anywhere. And it's because there's just something really unique and unusual about them. They will hide their true selves sometimes for that reason and try to fit in. But they never really can because they're just too special. And that's why I think Albert Einstein is a great example, right? Because Albert Einstein is somebody that kind of tried to fit in when it comes to like academia at first, right? Like that's where he thought he had found his people and that he was going to be a part of that. But then that isn't really how it played out for Albert Einstein, right? He had some very unusual ideas. And that's something that is what is so special about them. They are just geniuses, a lot of these people. Not to give this placement a big head, but I want to encourage them to stand out because I think they should, because they have some very genius ideas. They think outside the box in a major way, and it can be so unique and transformative to the way people view whatever that subject is. And then in result to that, it can bring about major advancements, which actually benefit all of society. And I think that's what's important to note is that the 11th house, and this relates to Aquarius too, is that at first it seems like all of this has the energy, right, of like first seeing something at a more immature level and a more mature level, right? The 11th house or Aquarius, the more immature level of it is we all belong together, we're part of a group. And it's about I'm just a part of this group. But actually, the more elevated view of it, what it's really about is what's best for everybody, about advancement of the group, about humanitarianism, about the legacy that you're leaving behind. Okay. The 10th house, the house right before this, is you reaching your ultimate potential. That's what the 10th house is about. The thing that you're going to be best known for. Okay. And now that you've painted the Mona Lisa, now that you've written Moby Dick, now what? That's what the 11th house is about. And the 11th house says, well, the thing now what are you leaving for future generations? What is the impact that you now have going forward? And so that's the sort of elevated view here. And I think that people that have Chiron on the 11th house can get caught up sometimes in feeling like they don't belong when really they have such an important gift to give when it comes to thinking about things in a new way that benefits everybody more. One of the last comments I'll make about them that's really funny is that this placement, I've noticed this placement at least a dozen examples in my amongst clients. They will pretend to agree with you and then they just go and do what they want anyway. So that's the 11th house for you, the ultimate rebel. The ultimate rebel. All right, last house is the 12th house. So the 12th house is like the weirdest house to talk about. It is the most abstract one, but we're going to do what we can to get through this. And it's Michael Jackson, so I feel like that's even that you'll see how perfect that is. They feel like they are often overlooked. In this situation, there's usually an issue around like an unseen issue. Okay. That's the core of this. I'm starting with the core instead of getting to the core. We're going to start with the core. The real problem with this placement is that there's some sort of unseen issue. This could be like an unseen family issue, an unseen health issue, an unseen addiction, etc., and so on and so forth. And honestly, it probably will manifest in multiple ways throughout their lives. I think all of the things that I just named probably happened to Michael Jackson, frankly, right? Like he had unseen family issues. He probably had some like unacknowledged like addictions of some kind, or like obviously wasn't he the one that was like being put to sleep literally to go to sleep? That seems like extreme. That seems very extreme to me. And that is like kind of an unseen issue here, right? The 12th house can be associated, by the way, with like medicine and sleep, so that's interesting. So this placement really should watch out like regards to their relationship to medicine. That all said, they feel like a victim a lot of times. They have this major fear of like chaos. They often think that they are going to be betrayed in some way. These are all things that I've seen come up. And they feel like the world is just very hard and they want to get away from it. They want to get away from the world. And so escapism comes into play a lot. A lot of times this placement doesn't feel like they belong on Earth at all. Now, here's the thing. The 12th house actually doesn't belong on Earth. The 12th house actually really doesn't belong on Earth. It belongs in this ether. The 12th house is a representation of the void before and after birth. Okay, so it's about when we leave this form, we recognize that we are all one, right? That's what the 12th house is ultimately about. And so when you have this placement here, you can feel that way. You can feel like, I don't really belong here on this earth, and this earth sucks and it's really hard. And honestly, they're right. People with displacement are right. This earth is really hard. People are cruel here. It is not easy to be here. Like, people don't incarnate here for easy lives, that's for sure. Look at how violent it can be and how harsh it could be, and so on and so forth. This placement can be affected by that. And that makes them want to sort of escape from it sometimes. But again, a lot of times it's because the true source of whatever is bothering them is sort of misplaced in some way. But it's so hard. But this is the unhealable wound too. So it's not like you could really place it ever. Probably the biggest thing that's affecting them that's so misplaced isn't something that could be healed on this planet, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? It might be something that is literally like in the ether and amongst the aliens. And I think that makes this a really hard placement because it is hard to nail down how to work with it. But here's the thing. This placement can be so inspirational to other people as well, okay? They are very well known for their compassion. This placement is very compassionate. They can do a lot for other people. And again, a big part of it is because they know what it's like to sort of just be in that place of being the victim or being in pain or being kind of like forgotten in some way. They can feel very triggered and compassionate to people like that are in positions like that, because they just have this unique understanding with this Chiron placement of what that really means and what that really looks like. And so they are really amazing. Honestly, this is the most compassionate placement for sure of any of them. Very compassionate. And also they can very much inspire people too through things that they do. And this can manifest in a lot of ways. Obviously for Michael Jackson's music and dancing. But I've also seen artists with this placement, and I've also seen people that are just like humanitarians with this placement, or people that start major projects that help a very large group of people or something like that. I've seen that with this placement. I've seen people several times that started charities with this placement as well. So they can be very good at helping other people get out of that headspace that they honestly can't really completely escape. So I feel like that's such a bad way to end this, but that's the 12th house for you, I guess. that's really all I got for you guys today. I would say I might go ahead and I want to keep it to an hour because I think like more than an hour might be hard to stay focused on just for something like this. But yeah, I don't know. Let me know if you guys have any questions or like what you want to talk about next. We can try that too, or I don't know. Let me know. Maybe like you can message me later and tell me too. That's cool. Well, maybe we'll try like some of the other asteroids because I think they're not often talked about, right? But yeah, that's Chiron. Again, remember that, you know, everything modifies, so whatever it's connected to, as far as other planets and aspects and things like that, but it would take
And
forever.
we're happy for you.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Oh,
Uh-oh. Hello?
oh, there you are. Sorry.
There. Sorry, no internet. Good old Houston.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
Thanks for being here, you
we're
guys. Oh my gosh, I forgot. That's crazy.
yeah, well, I think it's just some providers, but anyways, I wanted to ask, when we have our Chiron in whatever specific house, what does it mean with like what astrological sign that's attached to?
Yeah, well, that's actually a good question. So let me go back to, I'm going to go back to this real quick. Okay, so a couple things. Remember that Chiron stays in the same sign for about 4 years. So its house
Okay.
placement is more impactful just because it's going to affect, you know, everybody that lives that is like around that time frame for you. But that said, you can apply a lot of what I said this way. So the first house would be like Aries, second house would be like Taurus. So I think that, yeah, second house would be like Taurus. Third house would be Gemini. Fourth would be Cancer. Fifth would be Leo. Sixth would be Virgo. Seventh would be Libra. Eighth would be Scorpio. Ninth, Sagittarius. 10th, Capricorn. 11th, Aquarius. And 12th would be Pisces. So that does play a role for sure. So that's good to, I'm glad you brought that up because you can sort of think about them all in relation to one another. And that's sort of the art of astrology, is sort of alchemizing like how are these energies actually, like what is the overlap? That's the best way I can describe it, right? Is like think about the overlap of what are the themes in both of those. That emphasis is really what it's about for you. You know what I mean? So
Gotcha.
that's, but yeah, I hope that helps. Thanks
So
for
cool.
asking. Yeah, for sure.
I love
Cool.
it. This was fun.
Yeah,
And I
thank you guys
love
for
your
coming.
examples. Yeah.
I appreciate you guys for coming. I didn't put this out too much, so I wasn't sure anyone was gonna come. So I appreciate you guys. All right, cool. Well, I will post this later for other people that want to watch it or rewatch it or whatever. And if you guys have any cool ideas on things we could do these on, I'm happy to do these like maybe once a week or whatever. I just want to keep them interesting though. So let me know if you have
Yeah.
ideas.
Well, I think like what I would say, I don't know if you want to stop recording or
Oh
whatever,
yeah,
but
let me do that.
what I feel is like really helpful